I'm Metta Spencer, and I'm speaking to you from Toronto, but my friends are scattered all over North America. We have Peter Russell, who's in Peterborough, hiding out from the virus. He normally lives in Toronto. He's an expert on many things, the Canadian Constitution notably, but also a book coming out about sovereignty, the history of sovereignty. In California, we have another friend, Robert Schaeffer, who I got attracted to him because he wrote a book about separatism a number of years ago, which I thought was just terrific. So we've stayed in touch, and he writes about globalization and stuff. He's in San Luis Obispo, California. Then in Ottawa, we have Fergus Watt, who's the head of the World Federalist movement in Canada, and he's very active in other World Federalist kind of activities. I know he's been on another Zoom call until now. I don't know whether you actually succeeded in getting the Secretary of the UN on your Zoom conference call or not, but I believe that was the plan, to try to involve him with a meeting that you had at the UN. So it would be nice to know about that. And I hope that it's going well. And then in Washington, D.C., we have another old friend of mine, John Feffer, who is with the Institute for Policy Studies, which I think is probably the best progressive think tank in the world. And he runs the best progressive, news outfit for that journal online, I think, Foreign Policy in Focus. So we're all going to talk about sovereignty today, and not only the history of it, but to my mind, the more interesting and challenging thing is what to do about it, where it can go, and what's the future of sovereignty. Peter Russell, just say hi.
Hi.
And Robert in California, say hi.
Hello to all.
Good. And Fergus, you can say hi in Ottawa.
Hello from Ottawa.
And John in Washington.
Nice to see you all.
Very good. Now, I want to start off by asking Peter to give us a shortish kind of history, concise history of the development of sovereignty, which has a history.
The story that begins the book is set in 1973 when First Nation in our Northwest Territories, the Dene, asked if I'd come up and hear their proposal for a new relationship with Canada. And up I went, and they sat me down very quickly. And the first question I got from a woman in the group was, Professor Russell, I've got two questions for you. One is, what is sovereignty? And I thought to myself, I know all about that stuff. I teach that stuff. And I said, what's the other question? How did the Queen get it over us? Wow. I said, what a question. My goodness sakes. I never even thought of it. It's an important question. And they nodded. They said, yes, it is important, Professor. And so I said, look, I can do the first, but the second is it really is an important question. When I get back to Toronto, I'll go to the law school, and I'm sure they can fill me in. They're experts on that sort of thing. I went to my colleagues in law school. I asked the question. I went door to door, to about 5 or 6 doors. So my law professor friends, and I gave them a question. That second question, how did the Queen get over them? They said, "Oh, that's an important question, Peter." But I said, well, what the hell is the answer? I know it's important. Well, we don't know. So that's what set me off on an inquiry into sovereignty. And it sent me back to sort of a Wittgenstein guy to how the word is being used. I found it first being used in Frankish Europe, mainly as a synonym for seigneur, and fathers were the first reported to use it to say they were the boss and top dog in the house, in the family. The first political uses I then found came after Charlemagne, when both the Holy Roman Emperor, as he became, and the Pope claimed to be that God was sovereign. No doubt about that. He was the ruler of the world, but they were his sole representative on earth. And that set off eventually some terrible wars in which, well, Kissinger says at 1.8 million people got killed. But anyway, it showed me the danger of this absolute type of claim. So I traced it, comes down, it's by the 15th, 16th century, it's beginning to be attributed to the state. Sovereignty comes down to earth, the state gets it. The theorists of it, Baudin and Hobbes and others, conflate the sovereignty of the state. Of course, the state's a 5-letter word, it can't do a damn thing, or a 4-letter word in French. They conflate the sovereignty of the state with the sovereignty of the sovereign, who are princes and kings. And the next step is sovereignty, because of the democratic pushback, as you know, from the French Revolution on, is attributed to the people. Of course, no one ever wants the people to turn up who claims they represent the people, but that's where sovereignty has remained ever since for those who use it as a political term. I then watch how it's pushed out into the world by 5 European powers that had, as they say, perfected their sovereignty, Spain and the Netherlands and France and the United Kingdom and Portugal. And they are self-appointed licensors of who can be recognized as having sovereignty. Sovereignty meaning absolute and legitimate control over what happens in the territory, for making laws and all, controlling the borders, and even how people worship. So it becomes a vehicle of European imperialism until the end of the Second World War, when sovereignty is opened up through the process of decolonization, and 193 countries are recognized as having sovereignty. Sovereignty is always, it's not a thing, as I told my Dene friends. Sovereignty is a sort of action term. It's a relational term. It's something that's only works if it's effective, and it's also works best when it's both effective and considered legitimate. Lots of folks, you take the current effort of the Israelis to claim with American support sovereignty on the Golan Heights, they can well be effective, but I think much of the world will consider that's illegitimate. So in the pushback chapters, I look at the challenges to the claim of sovereignty. But before I do that, I open up, I have a chapter on federalism because, and Fergus will be interested in this, I see the emergence of federal state. Federalism goes way, way back, I found, in both Aboriginal North America and in Europe, many, many centuries of shared and self-rule. That's the key to sovereignty. And what federalism can do is you can have a sovereign state, but you can divide power within it. Sovereignty can be shared, and that's how to take the sting out of it. I call it the sting, the absoluteness, the oneness, which is the bad side of sovereignty. So federalism is the kind of hero of my analysis. Finally, I look at the pushback. I can't do it all, but I find sovereignty's fairly effective for 193, now 194 countries. It's illegitimate for those indigenous people who are captured inside the boundaries of states made by the imperial powers. And that's an issue I deal with a lot in the book. And I finally end up, and I'll end up here, I've talked too long, with sovereignty's inability to deal with the biggest threats to our planet and our species. The control of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, a growing heating of the world, the huge climate change, and the huge mass migration of human beings. And I finished that in December, and then I realized, well, the pandemic is also one where it's sovereignty's having trouble coping. And I look very carefully at the UN, and Fergus, you won't be surprised, I concluded it's done terrific work in all the areas I mentioned, all the threats, but it lacks independent resources and independent power. And so the only solution for that is a world federation. It may have to begin gradually, in which there is a world government, federal, and maybe most of the power is in the units of the federation rather than at the center, but it has resources and power, legal power, that are independent and can't be unilaterally removed or controlled by the units of the World Federation, which should be presumably the sovereign countries. So there you go, finished.
Oh boy, that's a really concise history.
It's a gallop.
The nature of all kinds of very important things. Thank you so much, Peter.
You're welcome.
And you've left us with the biggest pickle of all. How are we going to get out of this?
Well, sovereignty's in our DNA. I'm very convinced. I was very interested, for instance, in the Me Too movement, where women were claiming sovereignty over their bodies, and because it's like the battered borders, and they want to have control over what happens within their borders.
I want to discuss the future of sovereignty, or what is beyond it, maybe the alternatives to the current system of governance.
Well, that's what I talk about World Federation.
All right.
I think you're talking about national sovereignty and nationalism and populism being impediments to resolving global challenges.
In this particular
but in the sense that Peter was unpacking sovereignty, I think that there was, a more fluid use of the term. So I mean, the problem is excessive national sovereignty, but Peter and the Me Too movement, and there's the sovereignty of the individual, and that's a very sort of democratic purists would insist on that. And I mean, every treaty could be considered a step in the compromising of sovereignty. A treaty is by definition a pooling of sovereignty, and some treaties are quite effective and they have enforcement mechanisms, and but others less so, of course. So I think we could talk about the different strategies of overcoming the populists and so on. And there's Europe would be one big discussion, the European Union and the way that the gradual evolution of from the coal and steel community to what we know today as a sort of an almost federal entity really is a remarkable achievement really for overcoming many of the problems of national sovereignty. So that would be one, and the kind of work we do at the UN would be another, in terms of developing different institutions and treaties and so on. I'll stop there, I guess, for now.
Do any of you have a pessimistic view? I kind of think Robert does. In the little conversation we had yesterday, I got the impression you think that maybe nationalism is on the rise, that globalization and all of these transnational movements that I would like to encourage, and I think most of us would, might be jeopardized by the pandemic. Do you want to talk about this, about whether or not you're really as pessimistic as I thought you sounded?
Well, so I was agreeing with what I liked what Fergus said. So when you asked the question, what are some of the alternatives to national sovereignty? And one is what I describe as the one kind of alternative is what Fergus was talking about, kind of macro associational things. So the European Union or NATO, I mean, people in those things surrendered their currencies and their defense to responsibilities to share to other people. And that's a pretty remarkable sharing of sovereignty, or a hybrid form of sovereignty that's not rooted in the nation, only in the nation state. The World Trade Organization, the Paris Climate Accords, are all kind of that I would describe as kind of macro alternatives to national sovereignty. And they're the kind of things that when people talk about, world federalism and so on, are seen as stepping stones to that. I think there's a lot of challenges to those things now by nationalist and sub-nationalist groups and so on, which we can talk about. But I want to call attention to a kind of a second kind of alternative to national sovereignty, which exists in the real world already today, though in kind of neglected ways. So there's a number of different kind of hybrid sovereignties. So Puerto Rico is a commonwealth. Hawaii and Quebec talk about sovereignty association. And by that, they mean a kind of a shared form of sovereignty among peoples in a kind of a quasi-independent, but also quasi-dependent way. Those are kind of voluntary schemes for kind of a hybrid form of national hybrid form of sovereignty. There's also sort of coercive forms of hybrid sovereignties, and you already mentioned one. The West Bank and Gaza are an occupied place, and they were always seen as a way station to something else, like eventually they'll become a state or whatever. But it's been 50, 60 years now. Come on, it's not a transient thing. It's fairly durable. North Cyprus in Cyprus, again, it's been around a long time. People think it's going to change, but somehow it doesn't. But it does. It is kind of a coercive form of hybrid sovereignty. Taiwan now. A couple of states, countries around the world recognize it as sovereign. Most don't, not China and the United States. But it persists, it endures, it's pretty autonomous. But then again, it's got this kind of hybrid character. It doesn't meet the formal criteria of states, and it's no longer a member of the United Nations, for example. So, what's that about? And there's a new emerging kind. So you think about Northern Ireland and the Brexit deal, which is going to put them both inside and outside the European Union. What's that? And they have the peace accords, or a three-part U.S., Ireland, and England, kind of combining together and stuff. So that's an unusual, a different kind of a thing. So I mentioned those things because those are real and existing forms of alternatives. I think of it as kind of hybrid sovereignties that are not just, people kind of dismiss them like, well, they'll be gone, they're come and go. But they've actually been around a long time. So I think they deserve some attention as kind of the micro kind of path to something else. And if you look at the people who talk about sovereignty association, it's a way of accommodating, for example, the interests of the French speakers in Quebecois with the rest of Canada, and a lot more about that than I do. But it's an attempt, and the discussions with the indigenous people in Navanook and stuff is part of a way of trying to wrestle with that. To some extent, in the United States, the Native Americans are in this kind of hybrid, sovereign status that's yet unresolved, and it's the product of a series of coercions. But if it was more voluntary, well, maybe that'd be a different thing. Anyway, I just want to highlight those as sort of possible alternatives. I think that a lot of those, though, are under attack by anti-globalization nationalists, the kind of the sovereignty people and stuff. And the only thing I'd say about anti-globalization, you have to remember there's kind of two kinds. There's an anti-globalization that's rooted in the anti-immigrant, seize the borders, authoritarian, populist nonsense. And then there's a progressive anti-globalization. So the anti-globalization against the World Trade Organization started with the environmental movement. I was part of that. And then the labor unions, the battle in Seattle and stuff. And they're anti-globalization. They're against the World Trade Organization and, coerced labor in China. But they're internationalists. They believe in climate change, of course. They believe in reaching across the international solidarity and so on. So theirs is kind of a progressive left anti-globalization that I'm friendly to. So there's different kinds of anti-globalization, but the one that's kind of dominant now is the kind that is kind of against the EU and NATO and the WTO and Trump and so on. And the pessimism is I think they are breaking things up, and it's going to be very hard to put them back together, even if Trump loses. And I think there's a lot of momentum. Once they're broken, they're not going to be easily fixed. And so that's a problem going forward.
Interesting. John, do you think that, you're interested in transnational movements, and I'm just thinking, could there be such, or is there any sense in which we have a transnational sovereignty, a sense of, I think it would be more than nationalism. It would be the antithesis of nationalism, but it would be a kind of sense that the people of the world have some sovereignty as a community. Does that resonate to anything you're doing?
Well, it certainly resonates. I'm not sure I can connect it necessarily to any real world phenomenon. But before I answer that question, I wanted to add something to what Robert said, a kind of hybrid nationalism, or hybrid sovereignty rather, that I thought was promising at one point in the European Union, and that was the Europe of regions. This was an idea that was brought forward in the 90s, in which the idea was that regions within particular countries like Catalonia or Corsica would not have to worry so much about preserving sovereignty within their own nation state, in other words, wresting power from the federal center in Spain or in Flanders in Belgium, but rather they would be represented within the European Union as a region, that they would get recognition in some sense as a region within the European Union, that the European Union would not simply be this kind of billiard ball collection of nation states that were working together, but could also be a place where subnationalisms could achieve some measure of sovereignty and representation. I think it's a powerful idea. It did have some enthusiasm, shall we say, in the 1990s. But alas, I think it hasn't had a great deal of traction recently, in part because the European Union is under attack so much by a variety of different forces. And I think, identifying the impact of globalization allows us to understand that there's a real concern about loss of power and where power resides in the world system. The reason, for instance, that North Korea, perhaps one of the most tightly controlled countries in the world, has insisted so much on sovereign control of its borders is because it feels as though it is losing power to a variety of different global forces. Those are not just, say, global economy, like corporations, the IMF, the US economy. It's also the very people that you were asking about, Metta, transnational human rights activists, people we think of as having a kind of transnational identity. North Korea sees them as a threat. These are folks who want to come in and basically meddle with things taking place inside North Korea. North Korea's like, forget that. Our borders are our borders. And it's not just to defend against South Korea or the United States or Japan, in other words, other nation states. It's to defend against transnational activists.
I know a little closer to home some people who talk that way.
But if we are looking at this question of power, you would have to say, well, in terms of transnational sovereignty, there isn't a lot of power that resides in that particular concept. In other words, transnational activists don't wield a lot of power. They have some influence. They can as I was saying, if you're looking at human rights activists, they can have some real world effect. There's pressure on, like the Paris Accords on climate change. There's some pressure by NGOs, by social movements. But if we're looking at the kind of levers of power that either reside in national sovereignty, in other words, that nation states wield, or in popular sovereignty, that the power that a parliament has, then we don't really see transnational activists with that kind of authority.
Sure.
Perhaps it's the hope that we can gradually build up that kind of authority, but that today, as Robert was saying, it's not exactly a conducive environment for that. Although, and then perhaps we can switch into this kind of conversation, both the pandemic and climate change produce the kind of circumstances that demand a different kind of governance, obviously. And maybe there will be a decision at both a popular sovereignty level, but also a national sovereignty level, to invest or vest power into transnational authority to deal with these global problems.
How would that happen? Would it be that all of the countries that, that Xi and Trump and all these guys get together and say, aha, we do need to confer some power to a larger entity like the United Nations, and we, the states of the country, will cede some power? Or would it be that people say, we've had enough of these national states and their heavy grip on power? Can we find some way of going around them? They're not going to let go of anything. They're not going to confer any power to the United Nations, let's say, or to transnational organizations of any kind. And so we have to do it ourselves somehow. There has to be an alternative route. I myself am pretty skeptical about how politicians, national politicians, are going to let go of any of their power. Anybody thinking about that?
Yes. Well, just say a word. There is, to the best of my knowledge, please correct me, gentlemen, and there is no political organization outside the nation state, including the UN and all its agencies, that has claimed sovereignty. None. It's not been claimed. It could be claimed in a world federation if a group of sovereign nation states, in the same fashion that such units formed, say, the American Federation, to take one example, or the Canadian Federation, got together, enough of them, and said, we're going to create a world federation for which we will claim sovereignty. And the key will be the same as it is within federal nation states, which aren't hybrid when they're federal. When sovereignty is divided in the United States or Spain or Canada, it's not a hybrid sovereignty. Canada is a full member of the United Nations and insists that it is a sovereign state, as does the United States, as does Spain, as does Germany, all of which are sovereign federal states. But the power to make laws and tax people and so on is divided in these federal sovereign states between governments that cannot unilaterally take power away from the other level. The states cannot remove power from the central government of the United States, nor the provinces can't do that in Canada. And in Canada, the United States, and in Spain, and in West, and in Germany, you can't take power unilaterally, the centered, from the states. They have independent powers to make laws. And a world federation would have to be formed in the same way. The fact that Homo species, human beings, have done this on quite a few occasions, giving up local power over a province like, or a jurisdiction like Quebec or Georgia, and have conceded independent power to a central government, and in that sense share sovereignty. It's not hybrid. Hybrid's a bad word for sharing sovereignty. These are sovereign states with federal divisions, real, serious federal divisions within them. And isn't it wonderful to see that wonderful check on central power in the Republic to the south of Canada? Thank God they're independent and they're there. And that's not hybrid. Okay, I've talked enough, but I think you have to be careful of your terms.
Okay. Ooh.
Well, I would, you asked how these changes are how we get to some of these changes, and you also asked Metta about transnational movements. I think one of the things I've just in the last couple of years working on a project at the UN that you mentioned in your introduction, which is an effort to use the 75th anniversary of the UN as a lever to instigate a bit of a stock taking and exercise of reform and strengthening of the organization. And one of the things that we found with that is that there is quite a growing cross-sectoral interest in this idea. I mean, there's, across the board, sustainable development goals are kind of it's a la carte multilateralism, and in the climate change agreement we have a global goal, but independent, nationally determined contributions to that goal, which makes no sense. We're not, and no surprise that we're falling behind. And so there is a, among civil society, we're finding that there is, quite a lot of interest in this, which has not always been the case. I mean, most civil society movements have pretty much stayed in their silos and swimming in their lanes, and as a world federalist most of my adult life, I tell my wife that the change, this is it's been like trying to invite your friends to the high school math and chess club. It's a thing out there, but nobody wants to come and play. But now there is a broader interest in some of these institutional questions, and a recognition that with inequality and artificial intelligence and the digital economy, that the pressures for some sort of regulation are becoming unavoidable, and so that's one perhaps hopeful.
Just to add to that, if I can. My colleague Tad Homer Dixon has emphasized in some writing here in Canada, Tad,
yeah,
that the pandemic could be a tipping point to convince a lot of people that we need an authority with more global reach and power than the UN. The UN is still very much controlled by sovereign nation states. It's not independent of them. And this might be the time where enough major, not all the countries in the world, but some of them, maybe 3 or 4 members of the countries that are on permanent members of the Security Council, and maybe about 100 others might be willing to take the first step and actually give up some power and that's crucial. That's where Metta's skepticism comes in. They have to give up some power to deal with threats that aren't being managed effectively threaten our whole survival as a planet and a species.
Okay, but you know what bothers me occasionally about that is that the farther away you get from local, it seems to me, the harder it is for it to be democratic. So when we're talking about these big structures that are transnational or that maybe we aspire toward a UN that is powerful, it's not going to be very democratic necessarily. Fergus, how are we going to solve that one? Or maybe John, I don't know. I want a solution to that because on the one hand, I think, democracy is messing up royally right now. We're in bed. It certainly there's no country that's a great advertisement for democracy right now. But I'm loath to give up the goal of it.
Well, this is the problem, not simply of power, it's a problem of coercion. Because in order to solve a health problem, for instance, on the order of pandemic, you actually have to coerce people. You call it persuade, but essentially coerce people to observe certain laws, to stay at home, to get tested. And here in the United States, there's enormous pushback against that. As people say, I don't want my individual rights violated. I will go out into public without a mask if I feel like it. But ultimately, it comes down to a question of coercion, as with the climate change issue. I mean, how do you prevent countries, or how do you persuade countries simply to reduce their carbon footprint? Well, we tried that. If you have a relatively short period of time in which you have to get those footprints shrunk radically, well, you have to do more than just persuade rhetorically. You actually have to coerce, and not just countries. You have to coerce, fossil fuel producers, the oil companies. You have to coerce across the board, which leads many people, not me, of course, to the rather negative conclusion that you need a leviathan. You need an absolutely powerful institution that can do this kind of coercion. It could be at the nation state level. You look at China, which has kind of presented itself in some sense as a leviathan, a powerful centralized state. Not completely, not totalitarian, but at least aspires to leviathan status, or an international authority. And that, as you point out, Metta, is far away from, say, local decision making, because if you have local decision making which contradicts each other, one locale says this, another locale says that, then you ultimately do not have the kind of harmonization, coordination that's necessary to address an urgent emergency.
Yeah, just one comment on I don't see China being accepted by the world as the big power to straighten everything out. The democratic aspect of a world federation would come in two ways, Metta, by leaving most jurisdiction over most issues with the nation states. It would be a rather decentralized division of powers. But so one source of democracy is the democracy within the individual nation states who make up the partners with the world federal government. The world federal government has to conduct its proceedings democratically, and the internet is our great vehicle for doing that. It has to be elected, and Metta, that I'm advocate of using temporalism, the day of your birth as your global constituency, not the nation or town or city or region you live in. And its proceedings have to be open to scrutiny, to accountability. There has to be democracy in the operation of the central government of a world federation. That's how you try to make it democratically legitimate, in those two ways.
Great. How do we get there? Fergus, you mentioned that your group is talking at the UN about how to about aspiring toward some sort of greater entity or reforming the UN. Is that how do you want to move in that direction, step by step? Are there
Well, it is step by
plans?
step. It's much more gradual than that. I mean, trying to instigate a process of strengthening the UN in today's political climate is, of course, a big ask. What we're likely to get is an agreement amongst enough states to instigate a process. Whether you could think of the independent commission on global governance that existed in the 90s, or some other commissions or studies, these kinds of, but a mandated process. So it might be a process such as what Kofi Annan led in 2005 that led to some fairly significant reforms. But these are more gradualist reforms to the system as it is, and you're building a rule of law that is still based on treaties, on contractual arrangements between states, as opposed to a deeper political integration based on democracy and federal structures, such as what Peter was talking about. Let's remember that the European Union in its evolution insisted on democracy. I mean, you couldn't get in if you weren't a democracy. That's the way it is. And I think that it is, but it also shows that it is possible. You don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for every single 193 or 94 countries of the world to have accepted democratic principles and practice within their own state, and then therefore we finally have the conditions where we can actually extend these principles supranationally. We could, you can begin with a number of states and build it out as it were. But that's assuming that some of these states would even want to do that, and I think there's going to be a need of a much bigger push from below, and a recognition that you just aren't going to solve global problems within the present UN conferences and negotiating processes without some kind of deeper integration. And there are ideas out there for step-by-step democratization of international organizations. For example, you could many international organizations have a sort of an advisory parliament. The UN doesn't, but it's the outlier. It's the exception. There's the WTO does. Most of your regional international organizations have a parliamentary assembly. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has a parliamentary assembly that is actually an integral part of its operations. It helps monitor elections and do important work preserving a culture of democracy and cooperation within the European space. So there's
Fergus,
different...
I never heard of anybody saying I have voted in an election for the OSCE Parliament or something equivalent to that. I think that's an amazing statement you just made. I didn't even know such things existed.
The only supranational parliament that is elected is the European Parliament.
So they're not elected. Okay.
And those elected. Yeah, but the OSCE. But it is. The OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is still, before you get to the stage. I mean, let's think of how the European Parliament evolved. For the first 25 years of what we now call the European Union, it was using parliamentarians that were sort of on loan from the national parliaments, and they sat in the European Parliament for a period and constituted a European Parliament. And that it was somewhat effective. They aligned themselves along party, philosophical lines, not according to national prerogatives, and so they did constitute a sort of a European people's, a vision and a place where ideas would be contested and so on, and do the usual oversight and things that parliamentarians do. But it was in 1979, so that's 25 years it took, after you started a European community for there to evolve a democratic component to it, and it was in 1979 that it became an elected body. So that's just a little bit of sort of history for, in terms of how these things can evolve. But a first step with the UN would be to allow parliamentarians a more integral role there. Right now, it's a hodgepodge of civil society. They call it multi-stakeholder processes, and every different UN meeting has a different constellation of these stakeholders that get in the room, and what they're allowed to do in the room, whether it's just observe or whether they can talk to delegates and influence discussions and so on. It's very it's not coherent at all.
Well, yeah, no, you're putting it down, but I wonder if anybody agrees with me, which is I think that is a very promising route. Having NGO participation, but formalizing a system so that it's not so chaotic. There ought to be some way of allowing interested communities such as peace groups or environmentalists and whatever to officially participate in this. Anybody else on this issue? Robert, what do you think?
And the question is?
Yeah, I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, the question, all right, let me be quiet and just say, tell me some alternatives to the blueprint or a roadmap that Fergus has just laid out, which I think is maybe the most promising, but at any rate, there must be also alternative routes.
I like his roadmap. A lot of you may know, but maybe some don't, or this group and people watching us, that when just the year before the UN was founded, there was a big push, which will surprise, I think, the viewers, listeners, by prominent Americans to have a World Federation. They met at a university in Florida. I got my manuscript of my sovereignty book here. They included in their midst Einstein. They included some captains of industry, some senators, at least one Supreme Court judge, and they were worried that the UN would be captured and be the captive of sovereign nation states. And that just, in the end, particularly they were thinking at that point of controlling nuclear weapons. That just wouldn't cut it. There has to be a power independent of the sovereign nation states that could control and legislate effectively on these weapons. I mean, the UN has already passed a treaty making them illegal, but as we all know, it has no force. But the UN central federal government would have. So it's an idea that goes far back, at least in our modern history. And I'm impressed that it came from some very thoughtful and very powerful Americans in both the private and public sector.
Mm-hmm. So how would they have had it happen? Did they have a plan?
Well, they did, but events quickly overtook them. There was such a sweat, the founders of the UN, about an outbreak of what they then called atomic war with atomic weapons, that hydrogen bombs, that they didn't have time. You've got to form the UN right away, and it's easy to do that without asking sovereign nation states to surrender any power. They could delegate power to the UN and its agencies, including its Security Council, but that's a delegation of power.
So they didn't finish the job, and now maybe we want to pick it up.
Well, that's where I sit. I like to finish the job that those very interesting and thoughtful Americans asked us to think about 76 years ago.
Great. Now, Fergus has got his plan, but if anybody were going to pick up on where Einstein left off, either Robert or John has an opportunity to complete the job in the next about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
John?
I was hoping you, Robert, would jump in on that one.
So I'm a little more pessimistic, but not because I don't think this is a good idea. I think it's a great idea. But and I think that there's like I said, there's a left progressive community that wants to support maybe anti-globalization, but is an internationalist, and how to construct the environmental critique of the World Trade Organization was that it was undemocratic. That's exactly Metta's point, that it was an institution created by governments on behalf of corporations and their ilk, and they left out any concern about the environment or labor or stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So there's a left critique of that, and I think that's quite justified, and it's based on what you were talking about, Metta, that it was a lot of these things have an undemocratic character to them. The European Union has a pretty democratic character. NATO, who elected them? Who elected the generals? I mean, so there's that. But the climate accords was, that was more, there was influence, and NGOs had a hand in shaping it and so on. So that's a good thing. I'm pessimistic because I think that the crisis of the Great Recession and now the COVID-19 crisis has given an opportunity for people, but it both force people, like John said, to take action to protect borders and stop immigrants and stuff, which is what they're trying to do anyway. So it's actually strengthened the hand of the kind of the nationalist anti-globalists as opposed to the progressive anti-globalists, and that's a worrisome thing.
To what who were you? Somebody was quoting somebody about how this is a great moment and maybe an opportunity for us to realize that we all had to join hands globally, and that the pandemic may have some beautiful consequences. But
I think it's both.
That's your view.
I think it's both, Metta. I mean, I think crisis, equals opportunity, but there's contending forces who are going to try to shape it in their own way, and it's going to be a struggle. It's not the way forward is not clear, and that it's strengthened the hand of the nationalists and the sub-nationalists, the separatists, the people who refer what I call selfish determination rather than self-determination. Mm-hmm. And that's a bad and worrisome sign. And the fact that Trump is attacking the United Nations, I mean, it's not coincidental. He's been doing it for a while, and whether he kicks the United Nations out of New York, who knows? So those are real problems facing. And then the left, is kind of it's in some disarray, though. There's Bernie Sanders and the other progressive left in the United States, and people like him in other places are trying to move forward with a more progressive and a democratic way of shaping interconnectedness and kind of progressive internationalism.
To add to what Robert was saying, the far right actually has been far more internationalist than progressives have been.
Who's been?
The far right has been very active at a governmental level, at the level of political parties, at the level of civil society, and in the digital realm. I produced a report at the end of December outlining in detail how internationalist in some way the far right has been. On our side, as Metta well knows, we've attempted, progressives have attempted at intermediate stages between what we have today, the world of the nation state, and the ideal of someday having perhaps a democratic world federalism. We tried, of course, with various shadow efforts, a shadow effort to the OSCE, which was the CSCE at that time, the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, NGOs, social movements, in a kind of a parliamentary system, providing what we thought was advice and consent to the OSCE, CSCE at that time. Similar efforts in North Africa and in Asia around the same time. Out of that came the World Social Forum, which Robert was alluding to in some sense. It's the kind of the next stage of the anti-globalization struggles of the late 1990s. The World Social Forum emerges as NGOs and social movements coming together across the world to kind of coordinate. The problem was twofold. One is, who elected them? I mean, yeah, you can look at the European Parliament and be very clear about who elected that in a transnational sense. But who elects NGOs and social movements? It's a kind of self-elected process. And the second problem is, whereas the right wing has no problem with hierarchy, has no problem kind of delegating authority to an individual, to a leader, the left, progressives, generally speaking, is anti-hierarchy. Not all the time. Obviously, Bernie Sanders is a leader, and there have been leaders, but progressives in general have difficulty delegating that kind of authority, and are very much against kind of the coercive pressures of institutions. And so the World Social Forum has effectively collapsed because they were talking and not actually acting, because there were these problems that represented obstacles to action. The fact that people could not come together and decide politically who was in charge and who would kind of take these issues forward. So coming out of that, I would like to believe that there is something, again, that can represent some middle force, some intermediary force that is both representative and democratic and has power and authority to address global issues, that's between what we have today as a nation state and what we aspire to, which is world federalism. And I agree with Fergus, it's a great idea. It's just that either it won't come into operation in time to address the global problems we're dealing with, or it won't have the authority to deal with those problems. It'll be largely an empty institution, at least at the beginning. I mean, yeah, by the time it does get power, it's too late. So that's the crux for me, is finding out those intermediary structures at a transnational level with that are democratic and have the power and authority.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
I hope, John, you'll work on that and give us a design.
We'll see it next week in the thing, your publication.
Actually, John, aren't you, John? I mean, you know a little about what you've tried to do. You brought together about 85 people to talk, and I think you need to do more with that. I'll help you.
I do too.
Thank you.
On optimism or pessimism, as you get towards the end of your 80s, you kind of say, well, I've only got so much time left and I only have so much energy each day. I'm going to work on the optimistic side of this possible scenarios. Oh God, I know when I try to go to sleep at night, what you're saying, Robert, is all too true, and there's all these ghastly things out there that are working the other way. So I just, I choose to be optimistic.
You and me too. And I'm voting for both. I guess I don't have to choose between Fergus and John, do I? I think you guys both work the way you're going. And I think my way of working is more compatible with John's, though. So we could be a better team than I think. I don't see how I can help Fergus, unless you can tell me something to do, and I'll try to help you, Fergus.
All right, I'll work on that, Metta. But I think you know, at the core of the discussion is a recognition amongst all of us that there's a need for the world have to find a way to address the provision of global public goods and to address global problems. And whether it's through more agreements like the Paris Accord and just muddling through kind of solutions based on the nation state system until something else evolves, or whether there's a more intentional effort to build political structures. They're both pushing in the same direction. So I don't really feel like there's a disagreement in principle among us. It's just a recognition that there's different roads to Rome.
Except there's more nowadays, a greater sense of urgency, and
Absolutely.
maybe that, and clearly
and that's a good thing. Yeah, and I mean we need a sense of there's and I did read some of Tad Homer Dixon's writings on the pandemic, and I think when the world goes through an enforced period of social solidarity, that I'm also optimistic that this COVID crisis will engender some reflection on global governance.
Right.
Yeah, well, let's put our intentions behind that, all of us. And I think we already have, because this has been a very, I think, productive and interesting conversation, and should lead to many more similar conversations, right?
Thank you, Metta.
Thank you.
Metta.
Great.
Metta, yeah.
Good. Thank you, friends.
Share this
Thank you.
when I get it out, to the next few weeks, next couple of days. Share it with your friends and see if you can start a bigger conversation. Spread it out. Okay?
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Good
Bye.
night.
Bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.